Welcome, everybody. You're listening to the Getting Smart podcast, and I am Nate McClennen. And I'm excited today because we're talking about super important purpose of public education, which is around how do we reestablish this idea around participation and civic engagement in school. We've been focused on workplace skills for a long time and really thinking about pathways to career. And it makes sense because they're an economic driver. And we've been less focused on citizenship and civic engagement as an intentional part of schooling. Yet, I think we all would agree that we need this more than ever. So how do we best prepare young people to participate and give them the power to participate through their K-12 experiences? So that's the whole thought and premise behind our podcast for today. And I'm super excited to have a repeat guest, Fernande Raine, who's the founder of the History CoLab. And the CoLab is a design and innovation lab for civics and humanities. So Fernanda thinks about this every single day. So Fernanda, welcome. Excited to have you here.
I'm so excited to be here, Nate.
Awesome. So we're going to start today with a really easy question. What are you most excited about in your work right now?
Nate, it's an easy question, and yet one that's going to be hard to be short about because there's so much I'm excited about right now, partially because when the going gets tough and the world gets complicated, people that do history and the humanities, that's our jam, right? Like when the world gets really rough and the path forward looks fuzzy, historians and people that really think about what does it take to be human, what does it take to get us out of this mess, how can we move forward, where do we get hope, what are some good ideas, how do we organize? That's exactly what historians and humanities people do. So for me, the moment that we're in is one that's sort of boom time for the world of humanities, particularly with the curveball of AI, right? Where everyone's like, wait a minute, we need to think about what is it to be really human. And I'm like, yep, that's exactly what we think about. We've been talking about for a long time, which is the need to focus on the humanities and on history and on philosophy and on ideas and on this idea of drawing onto the kind of learning that helps us thrive as human beings and in connection with other people is coming up, and it's becoming a hot thing, which it hasn't been for a very long time. So I'm feeling like we're at the beginning of a wave where the stuff I care about most is becoming the thing people are asking for with most urgency.
I love that. I think you had a first mic drop of the podcast today, which was boom time for humanities and historians. And it makes me think about we've been in these places before, right? The context changes, the technology changes, but we've had challenges and we've had opportunities and we had challenges and opportunities. And historians are the people that really are recording this and hopefully helping us learn from history. So I too, I'm super excited. It's a unique opportunity. And I think our conversation around this, we're thinking about this idea of power of participation. And it emerged because we had written this book, Tom and I, and Emily Leipzig had written this book called Power of Place, which is about how do you help young people understand their places so they can make an impact on places. And you, of course, have been for much of your career focused on civics and civic engagement and history and humanities. And so when we came together, we said, okay, well, we need to figure out how to write a book on the power of participation. And so this discussion is not a culmination, but a stepping stone along the way in that discussion, in that conversation. So the other thing that happened, I think you told me it was about 10 days ago, is you released from History CoLab and a number of other partners this 18 by 18 or 18 squared grid that is really awesome. It's colorful. We'll put it in the show notes. Talk to us about that so our listeners can get some context of what you all have been thinking about production-wise.
Yeah, well, this came from the wonderful partnership that we have and the merger that happened last year from History CoLab and iThrive Games. Actually, let me edit that. So the 18 by 18 grew out of the partnership that we formed with iThrive Games, and that turned into that merger that happened between us and them last year, which is a merger between an organization that on the one hand is thinking about what does it take for young people to step into their role as makers of history and makers of the future, which is the History CoLab, and iThrive Games being an organization focused on what do we need to know about adolescent development and the teen brain so that we understand how to help them learn so that they're truly thriving. And you put those two things together and work together for a year. And what you realize is that the kind of experiences that young people want and need to grow into their adulthood are a very similar set of things. And we had been working for several years also with you all in Kansas City in implementing and testing and working with teachers on real world humanities. How do you do the humanities in a community connected context? And from that set of experiences that we had with teachers, there bubbled up sort of an understanding of there being a repeat number of projects and experiences that kept coming up and people kept mentioning. And then there's the world of learning science and teen-centered development or research that's been thinking about what are the foundational building blocks of learning. This is the work by Karen Pittman and Pam Cantor and Brooke Stafford Bazar, people that thought about what are the kind of building blocks of learning so that young people can find an on-ramp into learning in general, but particularly into civic agency. And you put those two things together and it maps totally onto each other. And we found this, we sort of, I mean, maybe it's 20, maybe it's 16, but 18 by 18 is sort of both a catchy term and a useful way to package something. Is it the ultimate 18 where we would swear that it's only these 18? Of course not. But it's these 18 will get you a good way down the road. It's the 18 learning journeys that a young person could and should complete by the time they're 18 so that they can grow into being their full human and civic self. And the fun part about these, when we looked at them with a historian's lens, looking at sort of Greek traditions of educational design and indigenous traditions of how people approach education and just different cultural traditions around guiding young people from childhood through adolescence into adulthood, they're patterns that reemerge all the time, right? It's like if you're growing a young person into adulthood, for example, to make sure they understand what their relationship is with their elders. So to have an intergenerational experience, for example, in an oral history or some version of a deeper connection with someone from a different generation so that you understand where you're coming from, learn resilience, learn the stories of how people navigate through life. Or another experience that is, classic project-based learning experience of doing a local history project. If you design that and say, I am a curator of my community story, I'm a historian of my community story, that's a very different sort of invitation to say, not only are you doing a project that's checking a box for school, but you are stepping into a role as a story curator for your community, right? So it's
Love that you're combining this idea of science of learning and development, which should inform everything that we do in schools and teaching and learning, and civic engagement, right? Like the idea of doing civic engagement experiences like you articulated in 18 by 18, these experiences is matching the science learning development. So there's this nice integration. Of course, PBL, project-based learning, is a way to do that as well. So great. Super excited about what you produced. Again, we'll put that in the show notes for our listeners. Let's talk about the opportunity. So you've talked a little bit here about like it's just a sequence of history. So you thrive on these times when there's some challenges, and historians and humanities folks can lean in and say, "Yep, we're ready for this. We've done this before." It is a challenge of the age of AI because we have some things that we haven't encountered before, but we've certainly encountered technology before. So you and I have talked, along with Mason and Tom, have talked a little bit about this intersection of crises. So let's talk about that. I'm going to just say that we have this disconnection crisis, we have this democracy crisis, and we have this sort of future of work and AI disruption crisis. And all three of these things are intersecting in a way to say this is the time to really think about how to teach young people how to participate. So your thoughts on sort of those three crises, the disconnection, the democracy, future of work / AI, are they all combining at the same time? Is this a unique feature? Has this happened before in some ways? What's your thought on those?
Well, I think they're related, but not, they could happen in a different combination, right? Like one is not causing the other. There's not a direct causality between technology and disconnect and the challenges of democracy. I think those three crises, Nate, are connected, but not necessarily causal of one another, right? You can't say one is necessarily determining the other, but they're definitely, there's this the confluence of these crises at the same time, not to mention the climate one, right? That's the sort of sense of limitations of our planetary boundaries, right? But the exciting part to me when I look at those crises is that the answer for all of them is the same, right? The solution to all three crises, even if they're not caused by the same thing, is the same solution. So if you design learning for human connection and for engagement in your community and for connection to an understanding of your role in taking responsibility for the needs of your community, you are solving for the disconnection crisis. You are solving for your democracy crisis because you are helping people reconnect with why does it even matter to create a system that recognizes the freedom and the individuality of others, right? The only reason why you need to care about democracy is if you have a hunger for freedom, right? If you have a desire to
Right.
be free and creative and an individual who has the capacity to make things, to do things, that drives democracy. Because if you want it for yourself, that's when you can start seeing, wait a minute, how do I make sure someone else has that too? And wait, how can we design that so that we all can be creating, even though we're different? And how can we negotiate in that space? So I think the disconnection crisis and the democracy crisis are connected by that thread. And then to the AI crisis, it's again the same thing, because when AI shows up and has a whole set of things that it can do that humans used to think they were unique at,
Mhm.
all of a sudden we're back to the things that make us specifically human. And Tom pointed this out so beautifully recently in one of his pieces, where he said, the things that make us uniquely human are to curate, right? To connect. And I think
Mm.
it was, whether to create was his last thing, right? But
Yeah, I
it's
think
like,
so. Yeah.
but that sort of the curation of information, the curation of ideas, the curation of spaces. What matters? What do we need? What do we want? What's relevant for us in this space today? And then finally, in creating something new and imagining what's possible or what we haven't even dreamt up yet. So, if those are the three crises, the answer to all of them is the same, which
Yeah.
is inviting young people to create, to matter, to find their voice, and to your point of participation, to step up, to step in and step up, and have adults see them in their magnificence. This is what my colleague Susan Rivers always puts much more beautifully than I ever can, to be recognizing teens in their individual magnificence and creating spaces where they can see how much they matter and how much they are able to create a new reality today and bring their powers in today, not just tomorrow.
Yeah, that's beautifully stated. Is that I love this idea of connection really resonates with me. Is that and that podcast you were referring to, this idea of how do we teach young people to curate, because it's not, the knowledge is infinitely accessible now. So it's about how do you curate the things you're seeing, how do you then connect with others to do something with that, and then how do you then to create something new, right? So these three C's there are really important. I think the other thing that this brings up for me is this idea that we have this tension in our country, maybe it's in all countries in the modern world, between individuality and the common good, right? And so the power of participation is around the common good side of things. And yet there's a lot, like the future of work is often around family sustaining wage, it's often around performance, personalized learning, which is really a goal of trying to help everyone have a personalized experience. That also is an individual thing. So we have this tension between individual and the common good. And I think that matters as we're starting to think about these crises and we're trying to help young people participate.
I think that's where the ability to connect students in these learning experiences with their community, all of these experiences in the 18 by 18 and in all the real world learning that you all also have been a part of in Kansas City, is making sure that young people's learning is connected to community spaces and people and needs, so that they're growing into an understanding not just of what's a job I can get, but what is the community asking and needing that I can create. The crafting for the commons is always going to be something that requires a high degree of creative and entrepreneurial capacity and the ability to connect with others and tap into the resources that are already in the community, which is so much more complicated than saying, I'm going to be an aerospace engineer and go sign up for this one job training program in this one company and become a super great technical engineer for this one job, which is amazing and much more straightforward than finding a role for the common good, right? Because the
Yeah,
common good doesn't pay directly. There's no set of jobs
right,
that is
right, right.
clearly defined, right?
Yeah, yeah, and
That's
I think that there is this, that even if someone goes into a very specific, they go into the medical field or they go into the, like, where there's a long runway and the runway is very narrow, and these are all good important things. Having young people understand how to participate in the secondary level and even in the higher ed, no matter what their career is, they still have to do that on their own time, right? They have to learn how to vote. They have to learn how to be part of their community. They have to learn how to communicate with people that are different from them, communicate with your neighbors, work together to move an idea forward that may be totally unrelated to your occupation or your job, but it's part of being a citizen. It's part of being a community member. And so I think that no matter what someone's career outcome is, which is important, they need to have these skills about how to participate. So let's pivot now to standard sort of civics education, right? We've been doing it for a long time. One of the original goals of the U.S. education system was to prepare students for civic engagement. It feels like that is included in all states, for sure, like the standards and things like that, typically in a social studies set. It doesn't feel like it's an emphasis. It's not really assessed that often. It feels like it's rudimentary and often fact-based. What's your thought on the state of civics education? What's working, what's not working?
That is a huge question, and it is one that I'm completely obsessed with. So we could sit here until tomorrow. I think the state of civics education in the U.S. has grown out of the history that we have with how, why it mattered and why civics education, the role civics education played in the U.S. It always, like, democracy was never something seen as fragile in this country, seen as something that needed to be defended or worked on particularly. You just needed to know the role you need to play so that you can do your job of showing up at the voting booth. And it's all about voting, right? Civics is usually about getting people to vote, right? It's not about figuring out how to not make democracy die, which is what civics education is in Europe, right? Or making sure that you build democracy after a dictatorship, which is what it is in Eastern Europe, right? So it's democracy here. It's like just being part of something that's kind of a given, which is a very different form of civic education than one that is geared toward making sure every young person feels why democracy matters, what role they need to play in it, what values they have, what opinions they have, and then how to defend them across difference, right? Like, we don't create space, never have created space in US civic education for surfacing different ideas and ideologies and political opinions and then duking it out, right? Partially because we had fear of letting people discuss communism, right? This came up again and again. It came up in the 30s, came up in the 50s, and again in the 60s. And it's like, we should let kids discuss different political ideas and political visions. And there was always this fear of, if we do that, then we'll have a whole bunch of commies, right? So you couldn't do that in the Cold War. And then after the Cold War was over, it felt like, why bother? Like, there is no, like, Francis Fukuyama wrote his famous book in sort of The End of History, Years of the Death of History. We're done. Like, democracy won, we won, and democracy is just the living into a free market economy. And so the idea so that's where civics education kind of, I don't want to say stayed, but it was like crafting a narrative that we all are together in the shared idea of voting and participation that's extremely straightforward and procedural, partially also in service of the fact that we were building a nation out of many ethnicities, many religions, many different backgrounds, and we wanted to keep all of that out of the classroom too. Like, why discuss all this difference if we want to be crafting one out of many? So it played a really important political purpose to have America be America. We are America because if you sign up for these ideals, that's it, which is incredibly powerful for building a patriotic narrative.
Right.
But there's a part of that then that isn't built necessarily from within, which is a commitment to the idea of democracy as a pluralistic process of finding a shared ground over difference. So I think that's just where we now have to sort of pick up, right? With thinking about, okay, first of all, how do we build civic education that truly allows for people to develop different pluralistic ideas and opinions and mindsets and viewpoints, and then talk about them in a classroom? And at the same time, how do we craft a shared identity of who we are together after we've had so much division over the past decade that came from suppressing that difference, right? So when you suppress the difference and the complexity, people get really frustrated and they're like, oh my gosh, you're not hearing my ideas. And then that can just blow up, right? So I feel like we have a lot of work to do of having civic education be wiring ourselves to embrace complexity to celebrate difference, to celebrate respect, and still find the common in an embrace of democracy as a place where we have different ideas.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something really fascinating there, Fernanda. This idea of my sense of civics education is that we've done a lot of work to say, all right, what are the three branches of government? How do you vote? What does the voting system look like, et cetera, et cetera. So from the fact-based place, there's some percentage of students that sort of understand that. Actually, I don't think it's that many because I think we don't teach it in a way that's really sticky for young people, but presumably it's in standards and things like that. But what we haven't prepared people for is this idea of how do you create common ground over difference? How do you negotiate when you have two very different ideas? The idea you said to embrace complexity is that it's a messy thing, and you can understand three branches of government and how do you understand voting and things like that in a representative democracy. But if you don't talk about complexity, don't talk about the difficult things and how to navigate through that, we are not helping young people become adults who can participate effectively. So
yeah, and it's fascinating to see, by the way, on that note, in Europe, we work closely with a network of organizations that does history and civics education in Europe. And there, in a system that was built after the 90s, after the end of the Cold War, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, to think about how do we do civics education in Eastern Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union, the thing they went hard they focused on, the thing they focused on centrally
right.
was this idea of multi-perspectivity. It's not even a word in our vocabulary, but
Right.
multi-perspectivity is the thing. It's like if you're in former Yugoslavia and you're in a classroom where different people have had their parents fighting each other, often killing other family members in a war that just passed, right? You're sitting in the same classroom. How do you approach a contested history topic with different perspectives in a classroom that is still full of that conflict and trauma, right? And so that's
Right.
normal to them. They're like, this is what we do all the time. It's multi-perspectivity, it's contested histories, it's different monuments, it's all this. I mean, it's just like what you do. And it's just fascinating to see how, we look at that now and we're like, really? That's a thing? Like multi-perspectivity,
Right.
contested histories? Cool, that's so neat. So I'd love being able to partner with that community there's a lot we can learn from working together across the pond.
And it's based on the histories and the lived experience of those individual
Yeah,
nations
totally.
and nation states. So okay, so we've talked about sort of these three crises around disconnection, democracy, and future of work and AI. We've talked about sort of the existing state of civics education, what it is, what it could be. So when we were brainstorming, we came up with these core principles, and I just want to walk through them quickly, and then we'll unpack them a little bit for our listeners as we work through this podcast. So one is that the principle of participation is learning of skills and knowledge. We talked about that. Sort of you have to have some skills and knowledge to be able to participate. Second is the participation as an expression of genius, that every young person has a unique strength and insight that they can offer, the ability to participate and offer their nation. The third is participation as contribution. We've talked a lot about that, is that I as an individual citizen, can contribute at some level to my neighborhood, to my community, to the nation, to the region, to the state. The fourth is around participation as co-creation and community fabric weaving. Learning does not happen in isolation. We do with others. We talk about this common good versus personalization. And then the fifth is participation as expression of voice and needs. And you've talked about this a lot, about this agency piece, of making sure that young people have a strong sense of agency so that their voice is heard. They feel like they belong. They're not othered in this process. And then the sixth is around participation as navigation in an increasingly challenging media landscape. I think you and I have discussed this, and I've discussed this with others on the pod, with Mason and our pod, of the navigation in the media world is going to get harder and harder and harder. And ultimately, probably the only source of truth that we know someone has been able to deliver is when I see them face to face in the real world. Even this, at some point, will become difficult to discern whether it's truth or not. So I just laid out these six principles, or these six core principles for participation, which we think can ground civics education and civic literacy in the modern world. What are your thoughts on those? What are those ring true to you? What jumps out as more challenging, less challenging around those six?
Yeah, I love these, and I love carrying them around with me as we do our work in different communities, and thinking about which of these have been neglected and which of them are so important to be elevating, right? I think of the ones that you're talking about, one of them that comes back again and again as one that's underrepresented in most environments is this potential, right? This the second one you said, the expression of genius, the recognition of every young person's potential. It's there's a disconnect between, on the one hand, what teachers believe and what adults believe in classrooms on whether every young person actually has potential to learn, right? And what we say we think, right? If you ask someone,
Right.
do you think every kid can learn? Like, oh, yeah, sure. But then the reality in a classroom is, well, that kid can't, or this kid can't, right? So to say that we believe every young person has something to contribute and has a gift to give to their community that they can unfold, there's a radical premise to that is absolutely not realized in classrooms today, but is beautiful. And there's a wonderful new article that just came out by someone named Daniel Yotkin from More in Common and the Beacon Project. Last week they published, or 2 weeks ago, this article about potentialism as a mindset and an ideology that is a philosophical principle that unites Americans across party differences, right? Most Americans, when you dig into what they truly believe that all people have potential and it should be giving that into the commons. And so this is a beautiful article they wrote based on all this research they've done over the years on what Americans truly, truly believe. And you're like, amazing. If that's the case, that this is something that unites us and we truly believe, then that's something we should be doubling down on in our learning spaces, right? How do we make sure that every young person feels that adults recognize their potential and see them? Because that's definitely not the case today, right? Like if you ask teams today, is that so? That's the first one. I think that's sort of an essential foundational building block of ensuring that every young person feels that the adults around them recognize their potential and help them grow. So I think that's definitely one of my favorites. The other one that I think is really, really central, and it's possibly also fresh in my mind because I was just at a beautiful convening hosted by Tony Burrows and his team from Cornell and Purpose Commons, which is this effort that's digging into the research around the importance of purpose for young people, right? What does it mean to have a purpose and to separate your idea of purpose from your career? Right? Like you can have a career and your career can shift because you get fired, you could lose a job, as if your job gets, whatever, made irrelevant by AI, but you still have a core purpose. Right? I am a creator, I am a storyteller, I am a whatever friend, I am a, religious component to it, whatever it is that your purpose is on this planet, can be connected to career. It doesn't have to be constantly connected to career, and anchoring young people as they grow, particularly in the later years of adolescence, right? This isn't something you're going to, if you have a middle schooler, don't try to talk about your purpose with someone who's 13. They have no idea what their purpose is. Their purpose is to get by and not get bullied and not be miserable at school. But once you're 18, 19, 20, 21, like the early 20s, like right at that sort of transition out of the home and into either the workforce or college, that's when their minds are blowing up around this idea of purpose. And it's being informed by the people they meet, by the relationships they have, by the experiences they have. So that feedback loop of I am having experiences, having emotions that give me indication about what I care about, right? Like feelings are an indicator of what you care about. And have young people supported in that surfacing of their true values and what they care about. That's something that Susan writes about in the paper we just wrote together about civic thriving. I mean, it's really the deep learning science behind that activation of young people's emotional groundedness in their own belief in their own values and value to the community. And then that super connected to that one is the one around contribution, the one around co-creation and making things, right? Because when you're making something, that's when you feel like you have a purpose. Like whether you're making a game or you're making a beautiful space or you're making a concert, you're making an event. If you do something in collaboration with other people in your community, that's when you start seeing that, you hear that voice in your head, wait a minute, I didn't know I could, right? And this is what I love about the humanities projects that we've been doing in Kansas City with teachers. They have nothing to do with civics. Like, so civics is not on the project, right? When young people are
Right.
creating art for the Truman Library or creating art about the Pearl Harbor incident, they're not creating something as a civics project. But in that process of making art to reflect, for example, in this last year's case, these teens, marvelous group of teens, made art reflecting the experiences of a Pearl Harbor survivor from who had been there and was sharing with these young people what her experiences was of having a lifelong dedication to stopping another nuclear war or another
Mm,
nuclear attack. And so they had this deep immersive experience with this wonderful elderly woman, and then made art of their expression of their desire for peace and what it means for them.
right.
And that artwork is now in display at the City Hall in Lee Summit, or was until recently.
I
And
love
that
it.
sense of, oh my gosh, my art, my expression, my story, my connection to the idea of a vision of a world in peace
Yeah.
matters to my community. Those young people, when they talk about their growth in that project, that's civics on steroids, right? That's
Right. Right.
everything you want to see, that I feel that I have a voice, that I can make a contribution. So I think, unpacking in our understanding of civics, that what you're trying to see is these light bulbs go off in a young person's brain, right? These, like, oh my gosh, I have a voice, I matter, I belong, I am someone who can contribute to my community. Those are the things that I think are really exciting and sort of can broaden our lens on what civics actually is, right?
Right, right. Yeah, though that makes total sense, and I love that you amplified those a couple different the genius, the part of co-creation and the voice and needs of young people, and I think I would add to it as the probably the one that we've spent the most time on as a community in education is thinking about like learning skills and knowledge, and
Yeah.
I would argue that you can give agency to young people, but they still need, and I think you and I would agree on this, is that they still need skills and knowledge because otherwise you have purpose you have purpose, you're excited, but you don't have the skills and knowledge to do anything with it, right? So we have to have that, like motivation theory would tell us, we have to have self-efficacy
Yeah.
in order to feel like that we are motivated to do something. We have to feel purposeful. We have to feel like we belong. All those things come in, and these 6 core principles make that happen. Fernanda, we're gonna wrap up here. You and I could probably talk for hours and hours on this, and I know we have in the past. What's the big takeaway message for our listeners if they're whether or not they're involved in civics education? What's your succinct like, hey, this is what you should do next kind of thing, and then I'll wrap and close us off.
Oh, I think the number one takeaway is to love a teen, right? Find some young person that doesn't have to be your kid, right? Like the number one takeaway is that we are each other's village, right? In helping young people discover their agency and their belonging and their purpose. And it usually isn't the parent who can step
Right.
into that role, right? Because the last person a teen wants to take advice from is their parents. So just to have adults, whether you're a teacher or a museum educator or a friend of someone with a teen, you could be that person just for in a 15-minute conversation, opening a kid's mind, making them feel heard, making them feel seen, challenging them to, step up and step in, right? That's, I think, the key takeaway is that enabling young people to develop their civic selves and their full humanity starts with every adult realizing that they're there and just waiting for an invitation to come to the table and to
Right.
step up and to say, if I need you to know this stuff so you can be valuable to me in the meeting. They will do that stuff. They will read whatever you give them if you just let them have that role. So I think that's the main
Mm.
takeaway is it's not anything big and fancy. It's often just seeing someone and being like, I trust you to matter at this event or at this table. And I think you can do it.
I love it. I think you can do it. Yeah, that's great. Let me just double click on the idea of we are our own village, right? We have the things around us. We have the people around us. We just need to empower those, give them the skills and knowledge, give them the agency to do the good work, to make communities better, and make the world a better place. A couple things that stuck out with me, and mostly these are just nuggets of things that you said, which are always beautiful gems. This idea of how do we design for human connection? How do we think about curation, connection, and creation, just reiterating sort of that previous podcast you alluded to. this idea that we don't allow for multi-perspectiving, and how can that become a little bit more of an important thing in our civics education. This idea of potentialism, that every young person has potential, and finding a shared ground over difference. I think we really struggle with that. And I think my last addition to listeners would be those principles that we articulated that you'll find in the show notes is that we should be practicing these as adults. We also should be thinking about our own power of participation. What are we modeling? What are we demonstrating for our own children if we have them, our students in our classrooms? And it doesn't need to be anything radical. It just means to say, hey, I am living in a community, connecting with people, and I'm contributing in some way because of the unique skills and knowledges that I have. So, Fernanda, thank you so much. This was an awesome conversation. I look forward to our continued conversations because I know we will have more, and I look forward to expressing more as we think about writing more about this topic.
Ditto. Thank you, Nate. It was such a pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in to the Getting Smart podcast today. We want this podcast to be actionable, insightful, and a great way to learn about what's next in learning. In order to stay on the cutting edge, we need people in the field to tell us what they're hearing, what they're wanting, and what they're needing to learn more about. Got a topic or a guest in mind? Send your recommendations to me, Mason at gettingsmart.com. And if you like what you're hearing, don't forget to leave a review in Apple Podcasts or subscribe wherever you listen. Feel free to share the podcast on social media using the hashtag GSPodcasts. Thanks so much.